Gotoku Studios has made a legendary series. The Yakuza, or Like a Dragon, as they're titled in Japan, franchise is rich not only in character and story writing, but also in its ability to deliver authentic Japanese culture and vibes. While this franchise is certainly much easier to decipher than the entirety of From Software's catalog, there are a couple of hidden surprises if you're only a passing enjoyer of the series. Now for the hardcore fans, you probably know the likes of Kurohyo, Kenzan, or Ishin. Maybe you even know about their gacha mobile game. If so, there might not be much you get out of this video since it's more meant for people interested in learning more about the series. And at that point, you've learned almost everything you can. If you're just craving for more Yakuza content though, stick around and feel free to correct any minor mistakes I make since I'm bound to with only my minimal knowledge of Japanese culture and the series as a whole. In this video, I'll synopsize the chronological history of the Like a Dragon franchise, with a stronger emphasis on the more obscure titles of the series, many of which didn't get a Western release until Ishin's 2023 remake. I'll be playing and discussing each of these Japanese exclusive spin-offs as accurately as I can, but for the main series, I won't go very far in depth past Yakuza 1/0. Partially because I myself am a relatively new Yakuza fan, and I don't want to play the games out of chronological order or spoil the story for myself for the sake of this video. Another reason is I want to make this video accessible to new fans or people who have no idea what I'm talking about. I don't want to spoil story for anyone who wants to experience the games for themselves, and these spin-offs are perfect for fans of all knowledge levels to understand because they're entirely unrelated to the long Kiryu saga that's been running for 7 entries. So while I will mention every game in the series, sorry if you're disappointed that I don't bring up the fact that Kiryu and Majima have raw, unfiltered, and violent. The day may come where I cover every entry in the series individually, but that day is far from now. Now, with all that out of the way,
how about getting the fuck up?
Gotoku Studios started out as an amalgamation of multiple different development teams at Sega, people that worked on hits such as Jet Set Radio, Virtua Fighter, Spike Out, among others. The latter of two being 3D arcade fighters, which may have helped during combat development. Curiously, none of the teams were a large part of the creation of Shenmue, at least to my knowledge, arguably the series that would be most related to what the Yakuza series became. During development of the first entry, producer Toshihiro Nagoshi considered this a good thing. At least for his team's morale, it put everyone on an even playing field. Personally, I feel like this was advantageous for a different reason. I feel like this heavy blend of developers all across the board allowed the Yakuza series to develop one of its most defining characteristics in its early years. That being its wealth of side content that adds to the atmosphere of Kamurocho, and especially aided in how varied or different side activities can be from one another. Of course, this is just a personal theory, and I haven't found any interview talking about this aspect of development, but I feel like the wide range of developers helped the creativity of the whole team. Some of them may have tried to incorporate aspects of different genres into this blank slate of a series. It created the arena fights, the gambling minigames, the tonal shifting side stories that evolved over the franchise into the eventual karaoke or disco minigames we see later down the line. Yakuza released to Japanese audiences on December 8, 2005, to quite positive reception. It was definitely a hit due to its story and combat. It successfully portrayed a gritty yet heartfelt drama of the Yakuza lifestyle, which it set out to do, and was really trying to accurately portray the city life and vibes of Kabukicho, Tokyo, which Kamurocho is based off of, a trend that follows additional cities added throughout the series. They went even as far as going to real hostess clubs to accurately portray those scenarios in-game. Although the Japanese release of Yakuza is what gave the series life to continue, the Western release nearly killed its chances right off from the start, due to its poor localization or a general lack of interest in its focus on Japanese culture. When the game debuted in its first trailer, it was supposedly of so low quality, even compared to its final release, that it turned off some prospective fans from the series. Now, the final product of the English dub isn't much better. Even though the audio quality in itself is good, The majority of characters that aren't Kiryu have either awkward line delivery or just don't sound like they should. Most characters sound like they're in their mid-20s despite looking 50.
There's a rumor that our money in the Toto Bank, all 10 billion yen, was stolen. Is this true?
Shut the fuck up, Chairman.
This information, where did you get it?
From Torado, a lieutenant of the Omi family in Osaka.
This is accompanied by awkward sentence mixing that tries to match the original mouth animation for the Japanese dialogue, but ends up overlapping words or putting in fractions of blank space between syllables and often makes what would be a passable and sometimes good English dub into a pretty bad one.
Detective, I had a ring on me.
I don't want to have to kill a man like you over a little girl.
You talk a lot of shit, but can you back it up?
What?
I think you'll find it. I don't die so easily.
This is the Kazuma-san I expected. I guess there's no other choice. Go! Kill this arrogant motherfucker!
Like I said though, Kiryu, voiced by Daryl Carrillo, who still dubs Kiryu to this day, carries the entire voice performance on his back. Though not always stellar and a bit more vulgar, Kiryu still sounds relatively like Kiryu, and he probably has the highest quality voice acting in the whole game. Probably because he's an actual voice actor instead of the Hollywood talent they tried to cram into this game's supporting cast, which is pretty subpar. Mark Hamill, yes, Mark Hamill plays Majima and his performance is okay at best.
I should kill you. Stupid! Fucking motherfucker!
The funniest part about this whole situation is that he doesn't even remember himself voicing that role. Despite Sega's hard marketing campaign and desperate attempt to draw in Westerners, it just didn't pick up. And the other potential fans very interested in Japanese culture were disdained over the fact that the original Japanese voice track wasn't included, which would have solved some issues over anyone discontent with the English dub. However, this wasn't due to the localization team considering that Westerners wouldn't want to listen to the Japanese reel. It was rather over a technical limitation that prevented them from putting both voice tracks onto a single disc. Despite all these issues, the original release of Yakuza is still a solid game. It definitely has the Kamurocho vibes and is fun to play, and since the English dub is poor at times, it can be very entertaining to listen to. Enemies in combat will sometimes repeat the same voice line, like I experienced in the very first combat tutorial. Kiryu shouting during a heat move was so jarring at first, but very funny. There's also the infamous line everybody knows,
10 years in the joint made you a fucking pussy.
which brings me to a unique aspect of the English dub. The amount of whiplash you'll get listening to the heaps of
Shithead, you think I'm a fucking idiot? Look at you, fuckhead!
all crammed into every other sentence like you're listening to a middle schooler that just discovered curse words. I'm sure the English dub would have improved heavily without the inclusion of all of this, but it is made for some great lines despite that. Originally, I thought that the dub had so many curses to pad lines to better fit the mouth animations, much like the jank sentence mixing, but supposedly, based off one article, a localizer details their experience working on the game, being explicitly encouraged to fill the game to the brim with curses. Take this with a grain of salt though, because there is no confirmation for sure if this person actually worked on the localization or not. So it's either a made-up story or a product of localizers being unfortunately underappreciated or uncredited for their hard work delivering these games to the West. Overall, my experience trying out the original Yakuza was quite good. I was pleasantly surprised by its good ambience and atmosphere. Kamurocho is large and still has a fair amount of side activities to do, albeit less than the games I started out with, for obvious reasons. The game isn't free from jank, but it's fun enough that I played it for way longer than I needed to for research purposes, and still plenty charming for what it is, and I can see how it garnered its initial underground fanbase in the West despite its rocky start. Judging the performance of Yakuza 1 in the West, it's no question why Sega decided to forego an English dub in the release of Yakuza 2. They barely even advertised the game as they knew it would only sell with their small fan base. We're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here, because it had to be released in Japan first 2 years earlier than that point, on December 7th, 2006, a day shy of a year after the first game in Japan. Despite its short development time, it already dramatically improves on the combat system of the first game. Multi-fights are not only considerably less frustrating over Kiryu's original crux of not being able to turn around while locked onto an enemy, but the combat was designed especially around them, and because of that, it makes the game a lot more fun. I'd argue that Yakuza 2's combat is even more fluid than the modern entries Zero and Kiwami. Sure, there is a wider range of moves and styles in those games, but Yakuza 2 has almost no delay between combos and moves, allowing you to constantly throw out a flurry of attacks and punches in all directions within seconds. It's just so damn satisfying and impressive how they managed to get the combat refined so early in the series. The overall presentation of Yakuza 2 is a lot cleaner than the first as well. Menus are faster and more fluid despite it still being on the same system. Kamurocho has better camera angles and seems to be scaled more properly with the character models, unlike how it felt at times in Yakuza 1 where Kiryu was a tiny ant in an absurdly wide street. Yakuza 2 also introduced Sotenbori, a counterpart to Osaka's Dotonbori, much like Kamurocho was to Kabukicho, and it looks absolutely beautiful. I've seen Sotenbori before in Yakuza 0, but completely forgot how fantastic it looks. Even on the PS2, it feels like a very welcoming and packed city full of life. During the evening, the golden sky perfectly fits this gorgeous city, and it has the added bonus of not containing an easily identified city ambience loop like 70% of Kamurocho. I enjoyed Yakuza 2 a lot, playing it for 3 straight hours, my first session, even while trying to restrict how much I played. While I haven't seen nearly everything, it's left a better impression than the original port of Yakuza 1 did, where I kept playing that out of morbid curiosity to see how bad some of the English dub could get. I kept playing Yakuza 2 to enjoy its amazing combat and the beauty of Sotenbori. Hopping off the height of Yakuza 2's combat is an equally exemplary story in Like a Dragon, Kenzan. The first on our list of Japan-exclusive spin-offs, and the entry's first dip into the next generation of the PS3. Released on March 6, 2008, Kenzan takes place during Japan's Edo period. Although the story of the game is rooted in fiction, obviously, the main protagonist, Miyamoto Musashi, is based off a real legendary swordsman who created a technique of double-bladed combat. The game does well to incorporate this fact in its dual sword combat style, accompanied with an appropriately badass introduction. Other than this aspect, however, the character is more of a nod to legend rather than an accurate depiction of history, as you'll soon see why. Kenzan follows the life of Miyamoto Musashi as he joins a military clan and promptly gets set up and betrayed for unknown reasons. We follow him and his only companion, Gorohachi Majima, I wonder who that's referencing, as they make for their freedom. Eventually, Musashi gets smuggled into a town where he effectively changes into the Kiryu we're familiar with. But he does have his own personality, which differs in how he acts. He's not exactly a one-to-one copy. Kenzan's story hook is spectacular. Despite the game not having an English patch beyond being able to simply read the menus, I was completely drawn in during the initial story until Chapter 5. That just goes to show how interesting the overall premise is, even when I couldn't understand a single thing going on dialogue-wise. I could still feel the raw emotions during these cutscenes, and they gave enough visual context for me to understand the basics. Now, unfortunately, after Chapter 4, I had lost the desire to skip every dialogue scene and only watch the cutscenes, and got pretty tired of not understanding anything. While Kenzan's initial story hook is probably the best I've experienced in the series so far, it can only counteract how unenjoyable it is to not be able to understand anything from a game that is 70% dialogue. This is not an inherent flaw of Kenzan, only in the fact that it's unlocalized. There is a channel called KAH Subs that has a fully translated walkthrough with cutscenes on YouTube, but even these took enjoyment out of the game for me as it felt awkward switching between watching the game and then having to catch up myself. I personally didn't like it and would rather wait for an English patch, which may or may not ever happen. But if you were to want to play Kenzan for only the gameplay, how would it match up? Mostly good, a little bad. Kenzan is a bit of a step back from how great Yakuza 2 felt. There is a bit more combat stiffness, a lack of interesting move variety from the start of the game, and Kiryu's debilitating medical condition of being unable to turn his back around and punch behind once he's locked on returns from Yakuza 1. Despite all of this, the dual sword stance is still badass. You slash through enemies with the power of God, even if the combo is the same every time. Aside from combat, you have side stories, presumably if you get farther than I did. Oh, and turtle racing. Or other forms of gambling you don't understand. Overall, Kenzan is a solid title. I don't think I would feel bad at all about its combat if Yakuza 2 didn't slap me on the ass and give me the best goddamn cosmic Kiryu of my life. But I'd recommend Kenzan if you can enjoy it enough with the compromises you have to make. Otherwise, either wait for an English patch or until it gets remade. Although I've heard that the story / some aspects of the game would be changed in any future release, so if you want to play the authentic version of Kenzan, you're going to have to make some sort of compromise. Unfortunately, this marks the time where I'm going to shift away from talking about the actual gameplay of mainline entries, since I've only barely started Yakuza 2 and broke my own streamer code in order to research it, and I don't want to start chronologically skipping and spoiling any story for myself. I will, however, still mention how the game was localized, which, in regards to Yakuza 3, was possibly the biggest train wreck in the franchise. The localization cut out a lot of content due to time and resource constraints to where the game feasibly wouldn't get localized without its removal. Content like shogi, which is more complicated chess, and the Hostess Club minigames. Most of the content was understandably cut as it would be pretty complicated for passing enjoyers to pick up easily, such as the shogi or an obscure Japanese trivia game, but other content, such as the Hostess Club, was cut due to a lack of being able to properly contextualize it to a Western audience. They basically felt like anybody outside of Japan wouldn't get it, and having played probably a similar minigame in Yakuza 0, they were probably right about that. Half the time in that minigame, I had absolutely no clue why the answers in that game are so backwards. It's like the game is constantly gaslighting you into making you believe you said something horrible when you're just trying to be helpful or nice, making me constantly second guess my answer and dragging it out way longer than it needed to be. Now, I'm not saying that those minigames were bad or advocating for the removal, but I do understand. It's a shame they got removed in the original releases, but thankfully when the game got remastered in 2019, all of that content got localized and restored, making a proper, authentic Yakuza 3 version for Western audiences. Yakuza 4 on its release didn't suffer the same fate as the previous entry, being released on March 18th, 2010 in Japan and a year later in the West. A greater effort was made to create a faithful and more accurate localization in the series from this game forward. And from here on, there aren't many lengthy localization horror stories as we're seeing from the previous entries, so it's an overall upwards turning point for the Western releases of the series from here. Yakuza 4 also introduced 3 additional protagonists, which changed up the story formula and added much more varied fighting styles to the series at this point, which had mainly only been Kiryu's dragon style minus Kenzan's sword combat styles. Yakuza 4 is also the first time in my research where I had a definitive list of minigames, which really helps when I can't really play it. And also speaks for how undocumented these older games in the franchise are, which receive less easily findable or accessible full lists of their content since people mostly play their re-releases. There is much more information about the modern ports like Kiwami or Yakuza 3 Remastered, but those aren't entirely accurate to the original ports, since they add additional content, which leaves me with such helpful lists to work with, such as the name of every Yakuza 1 side story. But I'm getting a little sidetracked. This is all to say that I think Yakuza 4 added some new minigames, but I can't really be certain as I had a hard time finding many minigames by myself in Yakuza 1 and 2, and can't find much in regards to vanilla Yakuza 3. Either way, be it from Yakuza 3 or 4, we are now in the era of fishing. That leads us to our next big game on the list, Kurohyo on the PlayStation Portable, released on September 22nd, 2010. Out of all the spin-off games I've researched and played so far, Kurohyo was the most intriguing and the entire reason why I started this video. It may not be as wacky and different as some future titles, but it is unique in the sense that it's entirely separated from the Kiryu saga. While Kenzan and future spin-offs still include Kiryu in some form or another, Kurohyo focuses on an entirely different badass with his own way of fighting and seeing the world. You play as Tetsuya Ukyo, a fighter with a philosophy, and a man trying to find his way in life in the Kamurocho we know and love, if it got demade into a PSX game. And man, I absolutely love this iteration of Kamurocho. It's got excellent ambience and mood lighting, fixed camera angles that either showcase the long bustling streets or the claustrophobic alleyways, all to create a chill and immersive atmosphere that makes you feel like a vagrant of Kamurocho. The protagonist differing from the rest of the series goes beyond just story or cosmetics. The game functions very differently than your regular Yakuza game, both due to technical limitations of a PSP and also the fact that it was developed by an external studio, Sin Sophia. Combat feels more fighting gamey, with a lot of directional inputs influencing how you execute combos and moves, all relatively unexplained by the game, just expecting you to experiment. And because of that simple presentation, makes it feel like a very in-depth and satisfying system that reacts naturally to your movements. I often found myself unconsciously moving while I was punching, as I typically do in a fighting game. This led Ukyo to perform moves that felt intuitive to how I was moving without me putting much thought into it. It just kind of works, which made combat feel pretty engaging. I'll clear up that I started this sub-series on its sequel, Kurohyo 2, which may differ from the first entry, although they were only released a little over a year apart. Yakuza 2 did give a huge glow up to its predecessor in a shorter time frame, but at this point in the series, there's already a lot of polish, so the differences might not be as drastic. You may be wondering why I played K2 and not K1. Well, that's because, for the first and only time in this series, Kurohyo 2 has gotten a complete fan translation produced by Team K4L, allowing me to fully enjoy the game without getting lost every 10 minutes. They're close to releasing a patch for the first game as well, slated to come out in August of 2023, relatively soon after this video releases. I'll provide links for their translations below. It was very easy to install, and I barely noticed anything beyond an NPC just saying W out of nowhere. The localization work is great in my eyes, and it's definitely better than blindly stumbling around the games if you don't know Japanese. And there is plenty more to K2 that I've yet to mention. More gameplay features, such as its unique injury system that affects both you and your opponents. If certain parts of your body get hit too much, then they'll start to negatively affect your performance in combat, such as getting more tired if your head or chest are too damaged, or being unable to block well if your arms are broken. This brings up the stamina mechanic as well, preventing you from being an absolute killing machine, throwing out a torrent of blows. You need to pace yourself and take combat a little more tactically, further encouraged by how combat works in general. You can dodge blows fractions of seconds before they hit you and get in a strong counter hook. You have a variety of unlockable charge or special moves that need time to pull off. Grabbing in certain styles is painfully slow and requires you to time it with enemy movements in order to get off any heat actions this way. You can also, and I'm not going to sugarcoat this, obliterate your foes through anticipating their moves. With a combination of analog back plus grab, you can grapple your opponent's arm or leg and completely cancel out their attack while dealing damage back. The fighting styles themselves all differ in how they execute punches or kicks, varying in speed or power or moveset. This all goes to show for how in-depth the combat is in Kurohyo, for just a silly little PSP game. And I haven't nearly touched upon everything. There's quite a bit of goofy stuff that goes on as well, being able to throw enemies into the fucking Shadow Realm, or the fact that you learn new moves by combating sentient wooden doll homunculi that seek revenge on your dojo master for forever anchoring their tortured souls to this accursed mortal realm, or collecting silly cats. As a side note, I recently acquired all the parts I needed to make my ancient PSP run, and the game looks great on its native screen. Low quality textures or models that were blown up over emulator are now properly obscured by both a smaller screen and lower resolution. Plus, I think the game is great to play on the go. No one activity lasts too long, and the story or sub-stories can be enjoyed in incremental bits like normal. The Yakuza formula smoothly adapted into handheld form. There are many part-time jobs you can do in order to gain money, each with their own unique minigames on top of the already existing staple minigames in the Yakuza series. Some of these minigames can be pretty fun for a little while, like the ice cream one. You can also encounter a funny side story, where you act like you're about to pummel a rude customer, until suddenly you get behind the counter and start making ramen for them. Kurohyo definitely has the charm you'd expect from the Yakuza series, while still feeling like a very different game. And I haven't even mentioned the graphic novel-esque cutscenes that have an awesome art style. Despite being on a handheld console, and not fully developed by Ryuga Gotoku Studios, Kurohyo pulls no punches on being an amazing Yakuza game.
We're now delving into some interesting side media, with Kurohyo getting a TV adaptation shortly after its release, as well as one for its sequel. I was expecting to only find traces of it on the internet, but to my surprise, it's actually fully available on YouTube, albeit unsubbed, which is absolutely crazy to me. I'm so glad that something as niche as a TV adaptation for a game that never got localized in the West because the series wasn't popular enough is still archived on the internet to this day. Similarly, in March of 2006, Similarly, in March 2006, just 3 months after the release of Like a Dragon, a prologue movie adaptation was made that depicts the early lives of Kiryu, Nishiki, and Yumi. Similarly, an actual adaptation of the first game was made in 2007, which is what you can see here. It kinda sucks. While the Like a Dragon movie isn't a great story adaptation of the first game, it's pretty goofy at times and has a lot of funny moments, mostly whenever there's a Majima scene, so they got his characterization pretty well. Sometimes things in this movie happen for no reason, and even with the context of the game, they make little to no sense. But it's just a wacky movie you might get a kick out of without much expectations beforehand. In the depths of the Yakuza Wikipedia page lie mentions of a Yakuza radio show that is still ongoing to this day. Obviously, this is pretty inaccessible to non-Japanese listeners, but they upload their full episodes on YouTube, and it mostly just sounds like some iconic voice actors of the series having fun. Curiously, the page doesn't mention the Yakuza stage play, which I only know about because of a funny Majima Moments video. It seems relevant enough to include, especially because they mention the radio show, but I guess this is why you do your own research. Harder for me to find was the Kurohyo manga adaptation, which I only figured out thanks to the Yakuza subreddit. Although I could not find online scans of the manga, only eBay and Amazon listings. The Yakuza subreddit also makes mention of a series of comics that retell the story of the mainline games, but I seriously couldn't find anything correlating to this. The link they provide also just takes you to the Sega homepage for Yakuza games with no mention of the comics? I'll take this one with a grain of salt, but they also mention a TV adaptation of Yakuza 6, which I actually knows this one. I actually knows things. This marks the end of notable side media I'm going to mention though. I haven't covered literally everything or announcements for future films that have yet to come out because I didn't think it was too crucial. I don't think I'm missing anything big or super obscure and buried other than the footage of that Yakuza TV adaptation. But the important things like the original movie and stage play are here. There's links below to all the side media that I could actually find in the description below as well if you're interested.
If you've been paying attention and know your Yakuza history, you may think something is off after Kurohyo 1 and 2. Well, that's because I lied to you. There's actually a secret Yakuza game that released in between both of these entries that I've omitted until now because it was way easier to talk about Kurohyo without a gap in the middle. This next game, however, is quite the unique entry. Out of all the spin-offs we brought up so far, Dead Souls is in an entire league of its own, going beyond being a spin-off story revolving around the same gameplay formula and instead going into batshit crazy off-the-wall zombie game territory. Before playing Dead Souls, I thought to myself, this will either be the best or worst Yakuza game I've ever played in my life. That about describes my entire experience with Dead Souls. Sure, I wrote some other notes like, game crashed a hell of a lot, very unstable to emulate. Ironically, the bugs made it scarier by making everything dark underground when I shot my pistols. But all of that isn't really something I can blame or credit the game for. but if I had the chance to play this on a real PS3, I bet I would have a fun time anyway. At its core, Dead Souls can be either really funny and wacky while having some archaic but decent gunplay, or the worst game in the series because it's so different. It's all up to your expectations. Mine were very low, but I was pleasantly surprised by its intricate map design that takes the open streets of Kamurocho and turns them into a labyrinth of broken buildings and vehicles, decrepit small tunnels and interiors that you have to pass through to get out of the alleyways. It blends itself well with the already interconnected architecture of Kamurocho, and also uses that to deliver a unique rendition of the city. Now, I haven't gotten very far, for obvious reasons, but this is what I gathered from just my first 2 missions. All else I know is that the game follows 4 different characters from the franchise, and may consist of other cities seen in previous entries. I was also excited to find out that it wasn't an on-rails shooter. I thought I read something saying it was or researching, but instead the combat consists of normal Yakuza movement, but you can pretty much only use guns. It still gives you the opportunity to dodge and kick the zombies like they're not even a threat, but unfortunately you can't kill them with kicks alone. The typical R1 stance that allows you to lock onto enemies in the regular games poises your character to shoot in the general direction he's facing with some tracking to enemies. There is also a first-person aiming option, but this is where the gunplay is a little inconvenient. You control the cursor with your movement stick, which is awkward enough to get used to, and it doesn't have a very smooth feel either, like you're playing RE Dead Aim. Though there is an upside to aiming. You can get satisfying headshots or long-distance kills, as well as use goddamn heat bullet moves, which are more like precision shots to blow things up. Dead Souls also doesn't take itself very seriously. Akiyama just kinda shrugs off the zombies as if they're getting in the way of his 9 to 5. The game still retains its typical Yakuza wackiness and supposedly the classic minigames like karaoke, batting, and more. Not much that I got to experience because of emulation problems, so I can't say for certain if Dead Souls veers too far into silly territory to where the story suffers, and some fans were turned off by it, but I know the gameplay also raised some eyebrows from critics. Yakuza Dead Souls is definitely not the best game in the franchise, but it does have that so bad it's good quality, or can be enjoyed if you aren't expecting much. I won't go too hard on this game, as it isn't taking itself very seriously, but being the black sheep of the franchise makes it very easy to trash on for more critical fans of the series. Yakuza 5, released on December 5th, 2012, is a new era for the Yakuza franchise. Recovering from the train wreck that was Dead Souls' mixed reception, comes a critically acclaimed Yakuza 5 with a new gameplay engine that once again overhauled the combat to make it smoother and more fast-paced. The same style of combat you'd be familiar with if you've played Yakuza 0, which we'll soon get to. Yakuza 5 was ambitious in the series, that it one-upped Yakuza 4, an already large title with 4 protagonists, by adding a 5th protagonist. Not only that, but including 5 major cities to roam around in as well. Localization must have been difficult for this entry, as it took Yakuza 5 3 years to come out worldwide after its initial Japan release. It got the same digital-only release treatment that Yakuza 4 did, however, Yakuza 4 got localized a year after its initial release like normal. Supposedly, the localization for Yakuza 5 was so bad to work with that Sega handed off the remainder to Atlus, who now localizes the series to this day. Atlus producers even said themselves that the game wasn't built to be easily localized in the first place, which holds some weight considering the fact that that could be said for every title in this series. In an effort to not pad this section out with such exciting trivia facts as Yakuza 5 introduced some new minigames to the series, such as air hockey, pachinko slots, whatever the hell these bottom 3 are. Pachinko, wait a minute. I'll keep this segment short. As the timeline goes on, less and less is documented about gameplay differences, save for new characters or massive things like a new engine. I don't want to just paraphrase factoids or spoil the games for myself, so we're moving on already to another Japanese exclusive, Like a Dragon Ishin, released in February 22nd, 2014. Ishin is yet another samurai game, this time taking place over 200 years after Kenzan, near the end of the Edo period. A time of civil unrest, because the goddamn Americans are screwing everything up again by establishing contact with the formerly isolationist Japan for trade, but most notably, by giving them guns. You play as Sakamoto Ryoma, another real historical figure who advocated against the military dictatorship that had been ruling over Japan at the time. The story of Ishin follows along this line as you try to make a better society for those in lower ranks of life. However, instead of using strategy and diplomacy, Kiryu instead uses his good old fists to slap Ryuji on the ass and guns to balance out the fight. Unfortunately for me, Ishin was also not playable on emulator. Somehow worse than Dead Souls, as I couldn't even get the game to boot. I imagine this is what would have happened if I tried to play the original Yakuza 3, 4, or 5. But those games are in a gray area where they're still easily available and playable as remasters, so I don't want to resort to sailing the 7 seas to get an authentic look at games I wasn't intending to play for the video anyway. Ishin, of course, did get a 2023 remake, but it's more of a rebuild like the Kiwami titles than a remaster, so I wanted to try and see what this was like. Thankfully, KH Subs makes a comeback with the ever so helpful subtitled cutscenes and gameplay walkthrough, although sadly only the first 2 chapters are fully subbed. The rest are just cutscenes, but that still offered me a good few hours of Ishin to watch. Nor does Ishin have an English patch either, so I would have been stuck in the same boat as I was with Kenzan, that being not being able to enjoy it much. But watching the subbed gameplay, I was pretty captivated by the first 2 chapters of the story, and I'm excited to play Ishin when I get the time and money to do so. As for the gameplay, I obviously can't talk from experience, but the combat looks much smoother than it did in Kenzan, which should be a given with how many years of polish this game series has gotten at this point. No surprises there other than the fact that you can just fucking shoot everyone, which is incredibly funny to see after the long build-up before some of these battles. Ends with Kiryu unloading his 6-shooter onto a crowd of unprepared samurai. There are multiple gun combat styles in Ishin, one incorporating your sword in unison with your revolver and another of purely gun, both of which have cool bullet sweeping attacks and gun heat moves, which shoot the enemies harder. Ishin seems to be more historically accurate than Kenzan in terms of what the main plot is about. Sakamoto Ryoma was very involved in the transition to a better Japanese government, and although it's just a silly video game, it's more grounded in historical legend or realism than Kenzan was, which went in its own direction. Aside from that though, I don't have much to add, so we're moving on to a big moment in Yakuza history, a moment where the series started to get more popular in the West, and probably an introductory point for many new players. Yakuza 0. Yakuza 0 was my first entry, and I don't want to be too biased, but it's a perfect encapsulation of the series. It's got the style, substance, the drama, so much goofy shit, Majima, an intelligent chicken real estate manager, tons of enjoyable side content, and much, much more. It's got a gripping story and great combat too. At the start of the game, combat starts out a little stiff and slow, but narrative-wise, it makes sense given this is early on in Kiryu's life. And you get to watch him grow as a fighter as the game progresses and unlock some crazy busted moves. Similarly, you can play as Majima, who shows no qualms stabbing or bludgeoning people to death with his metal bat. You have a choice of 8 total combat styles in Yakuza 0 between the 2 characters, which is a hell of a lot considering they're all very different from each other. Personally, I enjoy Majima's a little more since he's very agile from the start, and I never got much use out of Legends since it required a lot of upgrades. But each stance is fun to use and good for certain situations, which varies up the combat from just punching dudes. Yakuza 0 was a breakout success in the West. While the series had an underground fan base ever since its debut, it had struggled to perform as well outside of Japan and nearly died out of being localized in its early years. This game changed that, likely due to it being more accessible as a prequel, whereas a newcomer would be confused to jump right into Yakuza 4 or 5, and it's overall a strong Yakuza title with a quality localization done by Atlus. 0 takes place during the 80s in Kamurocho and Sotenbori, which is showcased in the beautiful aesthetics of both cities. The colors are more vibrant and warm than I've seen in other entries like Kiwami or Kurohyo. Kamurocho is bustling with life and busyness. The game does well to accurately portray its era in even small things like the way NPCs dress or act. Money is more plentiful because Japan was going through an economic bubble. There's a disco minigame, which is one of my favorites in the series. Structures you see in future entries like Millennium Tower and Purgatory simply don't exist yet because they haven't been built. The plot of Yakuza 0 somewhat revolves around Millennium Tower, which was very exciting to discover once I moved on to Kiwami. I think Yakuza 0 is so great for the series because it not only offers a good starting point for newcomers while setting up backstory, characters, and set pieces for the future entries, this also works in reverse for existing fans of the series series by offering new depth to the characters they know and showcasing Kamurocho in ways they've never seen. Old players can point to the empty lot by where Millennium Tower goes and be excited. New players can do the exact same thing when first seeing Millennium Tower instead. The same goes for recurring characters that show up later in the series. This game feels so much like jazz, not only with how chill the bars in Serena are, but the whole game feels great to play, and it's always branching off in new exciting directions that take the player for a ride. And without it, I would never be here now making this video. So thank you Yakuza 0 for being silly and great. Now we're nearing the latter end of the timeline, and we need to move on to Kiwami 1 and 2, some of the last remakes as of currently. While I won't be discussing the Yakuza Remaster re-releases, I will be drawing attention to the Kiwami titles, as they're more of a notable upgrade from their originals being completely remade in different engines, in comparison to the remasters that are essentially ports of the PS3 titles with quality of life changes and renewed localization like the re-added content in Yakuza 3 are. Kiwami, on the other hand, offers new story cutscenes and context for Nishikiyama after Kiryu spends 10 years in the joint, as well as more Majima involvement in general, especially with the Majima Everywhere system that further develops the relationship between Kiryu and Majima than was existing in the original game. The Majima Everywhere system itself offers lots of goofy moments like him hiding in a giant traffic cone or dressing up in different ways to try and sneak his way into a fight. Despite how much I enjoy Majima's goofy ass, I'll admit that in Kiwami I ran into too many random fights. At times when I was just trying to enjoy the game, it felt like every 5 seconds I would run into a different group of goons who wanted a piece of me, and it made for an annoying experience at times. The game's combat felt smoother from the get-go than in Yakuza 0, and narratively this plays into Kiryu already being a skilled fighter. Plus, the necessity to get back many of your skills and dragon style is also justifiable by you spending 10 years in prison and losing some of your edge. The same styles and many of the same abilities carry over from Yakuza 0, which makes it so you yourself don't have to entirely relearn what each ability does after you unlock them, but there are still plenty of new skills in both the dragon style and the basic trio to not make it entirely the same. This brings me back to Yakuza 2, when I started playing it and tried using some skills I unlocked back in Yakuza 1, and they fully worked without me having to reacquire them. I specifically had a moment where I tried using a move that let me get up faster, and to my surprise, I found that move just a part of Kiryu's regular moveset without me having to unlock it. Now Kiwami isn't exactly like that, as you have to re-unlock most of those skills, but it has the same cool feeling of seamless gameplay mechanics across different entries. Obviously, this game is a huge glow up from the original localization of Yakuza, not just because it's properly subtitled without an English dub, but the early entries of the series changed names of certain important story NPCs like Kazuma to Fuma, along with not all the Japanese slang being carried over properly or just not being localized at all, like how they constantly said Oyabun in the dub despite many Westerners not knowing what that means. Now a good bit of this was corrected along the course of the series, not strictly just when Kiwami was released, but in terms of what is a better, more cohesive version of the original Yakuza story, Kiwami has much more polish and quality. Yakuza 1 still has the charm of a scuffed PS2 game, but Kiwami makes the game more enjoyable past a so bad it's good experience. Kiwami 2 came out nearly 2 years after the release of the first, but it actually released after Yakuza 6, which we have yet to talk about. Originally, I wasn't planning on playing Kiwami 2 since I was trying to save it for streaming, but I'm glad I did because I got to experience firsthand how dramatically the Dragon Engine changes the game. The difference between Kiwami 1 and 2 is somehow on par with the differences between the original Yakuza 1 and 2, which I didn't expect to be possible this late in the series. Not like Kiwami was as bad as original Yakuza, but because Kiwami 2 is so much better. Despite only playing a few hours, it's been some of the most fun in a Yakuza game I've ever had, which again draws parallels to my enjoyment of vanilla Yakuza 2. This version of Kamurocho in the Dragon Engine feels so much more immersive and full of life than I've ever played so far. When playing Yakuza 1, you could go inside this sub-building to Serena, which I thought was a neat thing and was wondering why they removed that mechanic in 0/Kiwami. Little did I know, in Kiwami 2, you're allowed to enter some random buildings and completely fuck their entire office complex up through the simple action of running into objects. Not only is being able to explore the interior of buildings and environments we rarely get to casually explore in the series great for immersion, but it's hilarious the level of interactivity with the environment given to the player, allowing them to destroy literally everything by running into it and having NPCs react to witnessing Kiryu being an absolute force of nature. The game also looks beautiful in this engine. You're allowed to walk around in first person, which allows you to fully take in the city from any angle. At least a few buildings allow you to get onto the rooftops, which adds to a whole new perspective of the city. There are more back alleyways between buildings that further add to exploration and giving that feeling that Kamurocho is bigger than it used to be. That being said, I'm sure some of these mechanics or changes to Kamurocho's layout were made throughout the series and don't all originate from Kiwami 2, but this is my first time experiencing them. Combat is also on par with how amazing original Yakuza 2 felt to play. You can dish out the same consistent flurry of punches and kicks without relenting. You can now charge punches and kicks while moving, which makes the mechanic actually useful, whereas in earlier entries, every time you would charge up an attack, without fail you would get hit somewhere during the process, because it prevented you from moving and was overall too slow. The only downside of this combat system is the lack of different combat styles, which isn't a huge deal, but is the biggest difference from Kiwami 1. I had a lot of fun in Kiwami 2, especially with the side content this time around. A lot of it was accessible from the start of Chapter 1 when I got to Sultanbori. I enjoyed just fighting dudes with that kick-ass combat track returning from the original Yakuza 2, which had me fanboying an embarrassing amount. The mech arcade game is pretty cool. Golf for the first time in history is not the worst sport ever. Karaoke made me sad, and I had to refrain myself from gambling to prevent myself from going poor. The inventory system, which seems like a minor thing, got revamped, and instead of 20 general slots, you now have different tabs and seemingly infinite inventory space for regular items that aren't your equipment. Leveling up skills is also different, as it usually tends to be in each entry. You can gain lots of skill points from doing completion list objectives and eating food, which is a really nice addition to at least the early game grind, where in Yakuza 0 it was pretty hard to get enough money early on. And in Kiwami, levels were kind of important for their first boss unless you want to have a bad time, but you don't have much of an opportunity to get them. In Kiwami 2, you can learn skills pretty easily through its new systems. Just the general presentation of this game made it more fun for me to wander around Sultanbori and Kamurocho just for the sake of it. I enjoyed Yakuza 0's Kamurocho, but the beautiful presentation and seamless environment make Kiwami 2 nicer to slowly walk around in and take in the city atmosphere. I always took more joy in simple things like finding locker keys because the exploration was way more fun, among with other quality of life changes. I haven't even gotten to possibly the really good parts of this game yet, and I'm already really enjoying it. I know there's cabaret management and also Majima construction to look forward to, and I'm still over here content looking at the corners of alleyways in Sultanbori. That's about it for the Kiwami entries, both big upgrades for their respective titles and worth your time even if you played the original games. We're now reversing the timeline a little bit backwards to Yakuza 6, releasing 11 months after Kiwami in Japan, but a year before Kiwami 2. Yakuza 6 is the last game in the Kiryu saga, with it also being the first in the series to release exclusively on the PS4 instead of both the PS3 and 4, even though obviously the game got ported to other platforms later in its life. Yakuza 6 is a beautiful game being designed with next-gen hardware in mind. It was also the debut of the new engine, which puts its gameplay on terms with Yakuza Kiwami 2. That being, city exploration is more fleshed out than it used to be, and combat consists of rapid, flowy combos.
Now, Ryuga Goto gamers, if Yakuza 4 has 4 protagonists and Yakuza 5 has 5 protagonists, how many John Yakuzas are in Yakuza 6? That's right. You guessed it. 1.
The series reverts back to Kiryu as its only main protagonist, which makes sense given this title is meant to wrap up his storyline, which leads to the large variety of fighting styles from the other characters to be missing as well. Kiryu only has one fighting stance, which has remained consistent throughout the series, besides the recent Zero and Kiwami. Kamurocho looks fantastic as the cities generally have in each past entry, but here reminds me of the vibrant glow of 80s Kamurocho, despite it still having a more modern look, which is probably due to the more bloomy lighting from the new engine. The next entry is quite the weird one, and not something I'd expect from the franchise, being Ryuga Gotoku Online, which is a gacha card game. Released mainly on mobile, but also playable on PC, this game is actually more accessible than any of the other Japan-exclusive spin-offs, because all you have to do is change your PC's locale in order to properly play it. However, of course, all of the text is in Japanese, and after not even 15 minutes, the game froze up on me. And the gameplay doesn't have much to offer beyond collecting your favorite characters. There is a story mode based around a new character, Ichiban Kazuka, who we'll soon see in Yakuza 7, but here was technically his first debut in a Yakuza game as far as I know. While gacha games aren't really my thing, it would still be neat to have a Yakuza mobile game, and I doubt there's nearly as much text in this game than any regular entries, so localization might be easier, but it's obvious why it was only released for Japanese audiences, since there isn't much of a gacha player base in the West. If you're interested in watching a part of the story, KH Subs is currently working on translating the game, and as of now has the first 6 chapters available on their channel. Judgment is currently the final series of spin-off games on our list, being a detective game where you control Takayuki Yagami, a former lawyer who somehow knows multiple styles of martial arts and parkour. The game is a mix of classic Yakuza gameplay with new detective modes where you investigate people, crime scenes, or tail suspects, which admittedly looks kind of boring. The combat, on the other hand, looks very fun. Yagami's crane style is a smooth flow of fast kicks, and his tiger style is a regular, well-rounded, but quite acrobatic combat style. From what I've seen, Yagami is very acrobatic and quick, able to run up walls and chain that towards attacks, jump over obstacles and even people during chase sequences, and overall is a quick fighter in comparison to Kiryu. And you may have noticed, I said seen, not played, because Judgment is a little out of my price range currently, even if it is an unattached spin-off from the main series and I could theoretically play it. Unfortunately, I'm as poor as Yagami. Judgment was also a testing ground to see if an English dub would work again and also appeal to non-Japanese audiences. I listened to the dub version of the prologue, and while it's a little weird for me being used to the Japanese voice acting, the dub of Judgment isn't that bad either, and is quite easily much better than the first time they tried dubbing the series. The dub helped introduce new players into the franchise as well, who preferred it over the Japanese sub, who considered the lack of a dub to be a barrier to entry, prompting Sega to want to dub Yakuza 7. The game received the sequel Lost Judgment 3 years later, after the release of Yakuza 7. Lost Judgment also added a new combat style and tried to improve on the tailing and investigation mechanics of the first game, which received a lot of criticism at the time. Both games were well received for their story and characters, the story being well written and handling tough subject matter well, while the characters, like Yagami and Kaito, are just cool little guys. Yakuza 7 is a big jump in the series. I know I seem to be saying that a lot, but with this game especially, being that it overhauls the combat system from all the previous games into a turn-based, more tactical RPG, and overall having more RPG elements. This goes without mentioning that it's an entirely new storyline focused on new original characters, but the core Yakuza experience is still there. You still have big cities to explore and goof around in, Kamurocho and Sultanbori remain, although the plot mainly takes place in the new city, Isazaki Ishin, which is also featured in Lost Judgment. From what I've seen, the game seems even more wacky and silly than even moments of Yakuza 0 or Kiwami. I can't speak for the whole game, but I imagine Ichiban being a more lighthearted character than the stoic Kiryu helps in that aspect. I've seen stuff like Ichiban consistently retaking and failing a test over and over again. The game even has Yakuza carts, of all things. Apparently, according to this wiki page, you can get run over by a car. I love it. The game seems really silly, and the new direction for the series will help it from getting stale. Yakuza 7 attempted to revamp the series, which is essentially what Yakuza 2, 3, 4, 5, and 0 tried to do, but instead of just improving on localization or combat, they took it to a new direction, further added by an English dub that really attempted to offer an authentic experience and improve upon their past mistakes. Ryuga Gotoku Studios finally got to offer both the English and Japanese dubs on an equal level like they wanted to all the way back at the start of the series. What's even cooler is that Kiryu and Date retain the same voice actors even 15 years later. Kiryu's English voice actor was the best thing to come out of that Yakuza dub, so it's great to see his voice actor reprise the role. The series is also rebranded with the release of this entry, being subtitled with the authentic Japanese name of the series, and from here on out the games will be branded under Like a Dragon in the West as opposed to the long-running Yakuza. I've used them pretty interchangeably throughout the video, along with Ryuga Gotoku, because they essentially mean the same thing to me, but the developers and publishers felt the change would be more accurate for the series, which kinda makes sense given every mainline Kiryu game involves him either leaving the Yakuza or being dragged into some shenanigans with him while technically still not being a member. Like a Dragon, Ishin is the first entry where we see this rebranding in full effect, but I briefly wanted to mention Streets of Kamurocho, which is a simple reskin of Streets of Rage. Released during Sega's 60th year anniversary, it's pretty short and isn't a full game, having a simple looping stage, and not much other than a nice chiptune recreation of an iconic Yakuza theme, but I wanted to mention it since it technically counts as a part of the series and is neat side media. Moving back to Ishin, as I mentioned earlier, this is a remake of the original 2014 Japanese exclusive that, to my knowledge, doesn't change much in terms of the core gameplay or story, other than the fact that it probably plays differently, being developed in the Unreal Engine. Ishin is a great opportunity to experience one of the spin-offs in the modern day with an official localization, and despite my shoestring budget that prevented me from playing some of these games, Ishin has a free demo so I can experience the combat for myself, which turned out to be pretty fun despite me having absolutely no idea what's going on. It definitely felt more video gamey, with boss enemies taking way too many hits and having armor, which I felt might get annoying in the actual game, along with card abilities that turn the game away from being a regular Yakuza game into a more ability fest in order to actually take down bosses in a reasonable time. These trooper cards were in the original version, but only in its dungeon mode. Now they offer unique abilities or healing during all combat. Even if it feels less Yakuza than I'm used to, it still has fun combat. The sword-gun stance duo has very flowy sword slashes and is my favorite to use. The others don't seem as good, but the gun stance feels absolutely broken in this demo, where I can constantly unload 80 bullets into basic grunts without a need to reload, only being balanced out by the boss enemies that don't really get staggered by bullets. I've heard Ishin is more grindy than the rest of the series, and I can see that with how numbers heavy the combat demo was, but it seems like a fun game despite my limited scope of it. There are two more announced titles that have yet to be released, those being Like a Dragon Gaiden, The Man Who Erased His Name, which at the time of recording this, just today got announced for a November 9th release date. Additionally, Like a Dragon 8 was already announced, it's slated for 2024. This entry featuring not only Ichiban, but Kiryu returning as a protagonist as well, which for some reason, he looks like Yu Narukami.
That about does it though for the Yakuza series as to date. It's great to see that the developers haven't sacrificed their design philosophies and not burned themselves out in the process to continue to deliver us excellent city nightlife adventures. Sorry if I ended up missing anything or if some of the segments were kind of short. I didn't want to pad things out, and if I ran out of something interesting to say, I would just cut the segment there, not wanting to add any needless filler and just the most cohesive and interesting information I could dig up. If you like this one, I made a much funnier video a year ago because apparently I've aged more than Kiryu has in this past 50 years and I can't write jokes anymore, about the history of From Software. You can feel free to check that one out or subscribe because I'm not only going to be making more videos like this one, but eventually I'm going to be making individual videos on each game in the Yakuza series. Again, apologies that I couldn't talk about every single game in this series because they were either inaccessible to me or I didn't want to break chronological order and spoil things for myself. And with that, you may be wondering, well, why'd you even make the video, Cryvale, stupid poopy head? Well, first off, Strawman, thanks for not telling me to die in the comments section, that's very kind of you. But secondly, I was so enamored with Kurohyo 1/2 when I randomly stumbled upon its soundtrack in YouTube that I wanted to delve into each title of the Yakuza series to find any obscure games that I was missing. To my surprise, there was Kenzan, Ishin, and Dead Souls even. And I was very surprised to find the gacha game of all things to come out of this franchise. So while I might not be the most qualified to talk about this series, I still wanted to share that level of discovery and excitement I felt while researching the series. It's not exactly the same reasoning behind the history of From Software video, but through my process of researching all of these games, living, breathing, dreaming about Like a Dragon, Kiryu punching my sleep paralysis and saving my life, I've definitely become a bigger fan of the Yakuza series over the process of making this video the past 2 months. And I hope some of you get a similar takeaway from this video as well, and enjoy some of these kick-ass Japanese exclusive spin-offs. But that's all from me. Thank you for watching the history of the Yakuza series.